Your Royal Highness, thank you so much for joining CNBC.
Thank you. Pleasure to be back here.
I want to kick off by asking you to take a step back to 1977, and walk me through what was the situation between the kingdom and Russia at that time.
1977, Russia was still the Soviet Union, and it had expanded its presence in Africa and the Middle East exponentially. If you remember, Ethiopia, Somalia, Mozambique, Angola, they were all under the influence of the Soviet Union in one form or another, as was the then Yemeni People's Republic of Yemen in the Arabian Peninsula. And so we were very much in inimical mode, if you like, between the kingdom and the Soviet Union because of these events.
So the map was very different.
And because they were interfering in Arab affairs as well, in the Far, in Oman, etc., etc. A couple of years later, 1979, they invaded Afghanistan. And of course, that brought them much closer to the warm waters, which had been apparently a Russian mission since Tsarist times. And things looked very, very tenuous and very uncertain. At that time, also, President Carter was president, and the Iranian Revolution erupted in 1978-79. The Shah was toppled, and a regime came to power that called for the downfall of all monarchies. And that added to the concern and uncertainty in the kingdom. So it was not a very auspicious time for peace or for security.
And at that time, you were head of Saudi intelligence.
I had just become head of Saudi intelligence in September 1977. And it was a time, of course, in the wake of the Ramadan war after 1973, the oil embargo on America in the same year. And then after that, in November 1977, President Sadat declared his intention to go to Jerusalem and meet with Mr. Begin, which really was a very startling and very surprising development. He hadn't told anybody about it, and so it took everybody by surprise and made things equally uncertain, and if not more so.
As head of Saudi intelligence, how did you consider this expansionary tactic by the Russians?
It was very concerning and very disturbing. Following from Watergate, as you know, in 1974, and the resignation of President Nixon, the United States went into, how can I put it, particularly in intelligence matter, in retreat. The Church Committee in Congress imposed all sorts of restrictions on intelligence activities by the United States. And as a country that liaised very strongly with the CIA, that curtailment of their activity was very negative for our interests.
Do you feel like you were left in the dark at that time?
Well, not just us, but I think all of the allies of the United States were pretty much on wait mode to see what's going to happen with the United States. And that wait mode lasted until President Reagan came into office, when he again reactivated all of the security and intelligence arrangements that had existed before.
Walk me through how you consider the energy dynamic being tied directly to the geostrategic narrative, in the sense that how closely are the cooperation that we see with oil prices, whether it be OPEC in the United States or OPEC Plus with Russia, how closely is that tied to the geostrategic decisions that we see playing out today?
You mean now?
Today versus then?
we're living in a time of much uncertainty, and there is a lot of fog around. There is no clarity, a lot of contradictions, and a lot of, how can I put it, a lot of negative and very disconcerting developments. If you take the situation in Syria, for example, we really don't know where the United States is, for example. Is it in or is it out? And that's been the case since, not just since Trump, but also since Obama. You remember the red lines of Mr. Obama, nothing coming through on that. And subsequently, Mr. Trump's contradictory statements about removal of American forces, etc. So that's just one example of where uncertainty is playing out. Iraq is in turmoil. There is a popular movement of unrest and complaint going on in Iraq. In Yemen, the war continues, and the Houthis continue to disregard any international agreements or intention to go towards peace. Iran's very proactive intimidation, whether by hitting tankers in the Gulf or by sending missiles and pilotless drones to hit Saudi oil installations. So all of that is not very conducive to stability or security.
Is this a lack of leadership?
I think so. I think that's true on a worldwide basis, not just in one area.
Were you surprised by how loath it seems the international community seems to be to hold Iran accountable for what we've now seen the United States, Saudi Arabia, and other nations, including European countries like Germany, they now say that Iran was responsible for the attacks on Aramco. Is it surprising to you that the international community hasn't done more?
Well, not really, because they've been in that state for some time now. And I'll give you an example. The war in Yemen, for example. United Nations Security Council 2216 and subsequent resolutions specify an embargo of weapon supplies to the Houthis. Iran continues and has continued supplying those weapons to the Houthis since the war started in Yemen back in 2014, and yet nobody has done anything to sanction Iran on that. Syria, there is an embargo on Syria. Whether it is on oil deliveries to Syria or whatever. Iran has been supplying Syria with oil since 2011. And yet the Europeans and other countries have not sanctioned Iran for that.
Why are they so afraid?
I don't know. To me, it is startling. I mean, they admit that Iran is not only a security risk and danger, but also they publicly declare so, as you mentioned. Yani, European countries like Germany, France, and Britain publicly declare that Iran was responsible for the attack on the Abqaiq and Khurais fields in Saudi Arabia, and yet they do nothing. Iran has not hesitated to attempt assassinations in Europe. In Germany, in Austria, in France, in Belgium, with Iranian diplomats caught in the act, and yet nobody does anything. Denmark was a victim of that. Fortunately, Denmark did take action and imposed sanctions, and I think declared, broke their relations with Iran. But the rest of the European countries seem to accept that Iran has a free hand to undermine the security of not just European countries, but the rest of the world.
Who's at fault here for the situation that we see across the region today? Is it the failure of U.S. policy, or does it go beyond that?
I think it's more of an international lack of will to do the right thing. And so for me, it is a very, very disappointing and very disheartening development with Europe particularly, but also a little bit with the United States.
Your youth and early career spent at the height of the Cold War.
Yes.
Could you have ever believed that this rapprochement that we've seen over the last few years between Russia and Saudi Arabia could have become a reality, even as quickly as it has?
Well, it didn't appear so at that time. Things were really bad, especially after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But since the breakdown of the Soviet Union, of course, relations between the kingdom and Russia have grown. And under Mr. Putin particularly, they have flourished. As you know, the king visited Russia, I think, 2 years ago. The crown prince has been 2 or 3 times, I think, to Russia. The last time Mr. Putin visited Saudi Arabia was during the late King Abdullah's reign, when he was president for the first time. So it's been a growing rapprochement between Russia and the kingdom. And there's been an establishment of a joint fund to invest in both countries, industrial and other developments.
Do you see Russia filling a vacuum in the region that the United States has left behind, and is that a good thing for Saudi Arabia?
I don't think so. In terms of a vacuum, America is still not out of the equation.
It starts to feel that way, though, especially when you see what's happening with the Kurds in Turkey.
I know, but yesterday I read in the news that there's been a deployment of American forces in Saudi Arabia to support Saudi Arabia in meeting the challenge of perhaps future attacks on oil installations.
Does it surprise you that they would support Saudi Arabia in terms of the energy situation and at the same time abandon longtime allies in Syria?
It's always been about energy, hasn't it? Since 1945, when Mr. Roosevelt met with the late King Abdulaziz. And in spite of what has been publicly declared as American independence from foreign oil, the oil market binds the world together. And what happens in Saudi Arabia does not stay in Saudi Arabia. It has somehow managed to affect other countries. So I'm not surprised that the US would be interested in engaging with the kingdom on defending oil industry. It is surprising that America would abandon her allies in Syria. That is something for Mr. Trump to decide.
How concerning do you find that?
Very concerning, of course. And having worked with those people to meet the challenge of what I call fahish, which means obscene in Arabic, describing Daesh. Worked with them for 4 years and succeeded in meeting that challenge. To all of a sudden, fold their tents and silently fade away, and is not, I think, the right thing to do.
When you look at the region today, concerns about Iran, concerns about Turkey, these are countries that have pretty good relations with the Russians. Where could that benefit the kingdom in terms of security? Do you see the Russians taking a hand in perhaps helping to dial back some of these tensions?
I hope so. I hope Mr. Putin is aware of the risks and the negative impact of Iran's activities in the area, as well as Mr. Erdogan's regional ambitions. He's been a strange character that has developed hegemonic inclinations. And so if Mr. Putin can do something about that, it will be very helpful.
When you think about what we've seen over the last couple of days, the explosion on the Iranian tanker
Yes.
in the Red Sea, the folks that I spoke to inside the kingdom were surprised that this was apparently a ship that didn't follow regular SOS maritime procedure first of all, and second of all, they were working very quickly to determine the environmental impact that could potentially have happened as a result of this explosion.
Absolutely.
How worrying do you find what we've seen in terms of this uptick of explosions, violence, attacks on tankers in the last few months? Because this is something we haven't seen before.
It's very worrying, and it stems from, as I mentioned, Iran's very adventurous and very malign, if I can say, ambitions in the area. I think this tanker incident is very much in line with what Iran has been doing. It wants to show that they are victims as well, when actually they're perpetrators. And so whatever the reasons for the explosions, I think people will find out with modern technology and with satellite imagery and so on. We can pretty much identify what happened on that tanker and how as you mentioned, the maritime regulations were followed or not by the tanker crew and their owners. So we'll have to wait and see.
What is the greatest concern to you about the region today, given your long and wide experience in terms of intelligence? Is it the potential rise again of an organization like Daesh? Is it ISIS fighters who may be escaping from prisons in Syria? Is it the fact that there are new alliances across the region, this Russia-Saudi alliance, for example?
I don't think we can give a priority over one danger over another. Terrorism has always been a danger. We've been the victims of terrorism. People forget, that particularly the kingdom has been the victim of terrorism since the 60s and 70s, when so-called the Palestine liberation organizations were operating at that time. They targeted Saudi Arabia at that time. At that time, it was because of our close friendship with the United States. Ironically, the so-called Islamist groups that have targeted Saudi Arabia have targeted also because of our close relationship with the United States. So whether it was the far left targeting us or the far right targeting us, the reason was the same. We've had to live with that, and alhamdulillah, we've managed to meet that challenge and successfully. And but the danger exists. If it's not Daesh, it could be the son of Daesh or the grandson of Daesh. That is something that has to be dealt with on a worldwide basis and not just by Saudi Arabia. That's one danger. Of course, an equally important and immediate danger is, as I mentioned, Iran's territorial and ideological ambitions in the area. You see their activities in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, even among the Palestinians, in Yemen, in East Africa. I was just reading in the press today about Iranians being arrested even in Latin America, or Iranian supporters in Latin America. So that is also a worrying, but for me, the lack of clarity of the positions of powers like the United States and Europe adds to the concern and the wariness that I feel around the situation.
If you had to describe U.S. foreign policy today in the region in a couple of words, what would it be?
I really can't. Those are a couple of words. I can't.
Your Royal Highness, thank you for joining CNBC.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back with you.